So at this point, I've already done a couple of videos on the channel talking about how older games play on the Steam Deck, specifically games from like the 2000s or the 2010s maybe. Games that, by today's standards, might be a little bit dated, but nonetheless play really, really well, and thanks to being older titles, have really solid battery life on the Steam Deck. And when I made those lists, I'm not sure that I necessarily picked the most popular games of the era that I could have chosen for older games that play well on the deck, but at least a few of you had commented that you would like to see a similar style video where I talk about older games that play well on the deck, but specifically titles that were AAA, so really big, heavy productions that were not indie titles in any sense of the word. So that's what today's video is all about. I basically just picked 5 just pure AAA releases of yesteryear to kind of highlight that run really well on the deck, games that I've been testing recently and have had a really good time playing, so let's just go ahead and jump right in with Borderlands 2. Borderlands 2 is as good today as it was in 2012. It's a gorgeous game, provided you don't mind that cel-shaded kind of cartoony look. The writing's hilarious, and as one of the earliest looter shooters, there are guns galore that you can just have a blast with. And it's all set against the colorful world of Pandora and a range of well-voiced characters, including, of course, Handsome Jack. And as a 10-year-old game at this point, it runs butter smooth on the Steam Deck, maintaining a solid 60 FPS in my time with it. I might have caught the occasional hiccup when loading a new area, and I did find at least one instance where a few of the barrels had super low resolution textures as if they just failed to fully load in, but for the most part it was totally flawless. Not just graphically, but also from a control standpoint, everything's pretty much ready to go as soon as you load in, and I didn't have to spend any time tweaking controls or remapping anything to have a good time. Now that's not to say that you can't improve the control scheme further by taking advantage of the rear paddles and mapping them to some of the face buttons if you want to keep finer control on the sticks, but still, I'm just saying that right out of the box I had no issues with the controls and it just felt as good as any time I'd played Borderlands 2 on console or Vita for that matter. I did notice a weirdly long initial load time, and after waking it back up to continue at one point, the create online session seems like it kinda got stuck in a loop, but aside from that one minor hiccup, everything else seems to feel as solid as any other versions of Borderlands 2 I've played. And certainly a better experience than when I previously played it on the Vita. But one thing I'll say for the Vita, or the Switch for that matter, is that games as vibrant and colorful as Borderlands really would benefit from an OLED display, and Borderlands 2 is a good example of a game where I'd actually stop and wonder if maybe I should play it elsewhere, but considering Borderlands 2 can run at max settings on the deck means that I'll probably still give the edge to the Steam Deck anytime I feel like jumping back in. Next up, going a little bit further back in time to 2009, the original entry from the series that I at least mentioned on one of those prior videos would be Arkham Asylum. Arkham Asylum is the Batman game that laid the groundwork for the rest of the Arkham series, and it definitely had to make an appearance on this list. Now I know I already mentioned Arkham City in the last Old Games on Deck video on account of it expanding everything that made Arkham Asylum so great, but that doesn't mean you should just leave Arkham Asylum behind or anything, because it's still a tremendous Batman story in its own right. No, you won't be tooling around Gotham in a tanky Batmobile or anything like that, and the graphics aren't as impressive as they once were, but it's still a game that is a blast to revisit. Not just as some honorary mention because of how important it was to the superhero genre period, but rather because its story and pacing are still deliriously entertaining over a decade since its release. The way that Arkham Asylum interweaves action, stealth, puzzle solving, and detective work shows that the developers didn't just set out to make a cool game with a Batman coat of paint, but rather that they insisted on taking the defining elements of the character and making sure they weren't just echoed in the mechanics, but integral to ensuring that the gameplay would come together harmoniously. Now sure, any of the Arkham games will help you to feel like the Caped Crusader, but Asylum deserves special mention for being the first to bring everything together so expertly. Beating up on Joker's goons, going toe-to-toe with classic villains, using a variety of gadgets to unearth clues and solve puzzles, it all feels tremendous, and all of it's set against a classic Batman vs. Joker backdrop with some exceedingly cool moments, like when you find out that Bruce has a backup Batcave on Arkham Island just in case, which is just such a Batman thing to do and yet still so incredibly rad. Now, like some of the other Arkham titles, this one is listed as unsupported, but as soon as I ran it under Experimental Proton, it worked just fine. And like with most of the older games that you could play on the Steam Deck, it keeps a butter smooth 60 FPS even with all settings maxed out. Also, all of the controls default to the 360 controller mapping, so it should feel pretty familiar if you've ever played the Arkham titles on console. Although with the benefit of the deck's rear paddles, I might end up remapping some of the combat controls to the rear just so I can keep better control of the camera whenever I'm doing counterattacks while I'm surrounded. So if you've never played any of the Arkham games before, Asylum is an obvious starting point and a solid performer on the deck so far. But next up, let's go ahead and switch genres from superheroes to high fantasy with The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. This was a game that a few of you requested I test out on the Steam Deck, or you just said that you were enjoying yourselves, so I figured I would just go ahead and give it a go. Now, I hadn't played this in any serious way since the 360 era back in 2006, and I say serious way because a few months ago I did play it briefly, but only long enough so that I could check it out with a friend of mine who wanted to see how it played on the Xbox Series X, where it got features like an FPS boost, auto HDR, and 4K resolution. And while it doesn't look that stellar on the Steam Deck necessarily, it's still a really pretty game artistically speaking. Initially it looked like I was stuck at 1280 by 720 for the resolution, but after restarting the game and applying the graphics settings, I got it to the deck's native resolution of 1280 by 800 and was able to pretty much max out all of the settings, which again makes sense considering we're talking about a game that's almost 20 years old at this point. And after making it through the opening sequence and fleeing the prison and the sewers, stepping out into the open world still looks pretty awesome. I mean, the graphics are dated for sure, but it's still pretty to look at. Although I did notice a lot of foliage pop in at the mid-range, which it could be a little distracting I guess, but personally I didn't mind it that much. Now what I did mind is that you do have to lean pretty heavily on either the touchpads or the gyro controls for manipulating the cursor if you want to respond to dialogue prompts or manage your inventory in the menu. And if you've played an Elder Scrolls game before, you know you'll be spending a lot of time hopping through menus to manage things like loot, armor, equipment, weapons, spells, and the like, so I feel like this could get a little bit tedious over time. Not so tedious that it's unplayable or anything, but if you're looking for a handheld experience with a more streamlined menu and better controller support in that high fantasy realm, you might just want to go ahead and jump into Skyrim to get your fix, which also plays really well on the deck. But provided you don't mind a little extra work to perform all of your actions, Oblivion's still a blast if you're looking for some high fantasy adventure. It was really enjoyable diving back in and hearing Patrick Stewart's voice greeting me once more as the Emperor before getting my class squared away and embarking on my quest. And I thought it was cool that you leveled up and got stronger based on the things that you repeatedly did. So if you got hit a bunch while wearing light armor, you'd level up in light armor. Run and jump a lot, and you'd get better at running and jumping. I always thought this made a lot more sense than just arbitrary stat allocation, and the first-person combat still feels great, if not maybe a little bit simple by today's standards. Next up is technically the oldest title on this list, but also kind of not really because it gets remade over and over again, but I'm including it because spooky season's right around the corner, and that is the Resident Evil remake from 2001. Now, it's crazy for me to think that the first time I played this game was over 20 years ago, but crazier still is that it still holds up tremendously well even today. For that matter, I'd even argue the original Resident Evil 1 still holds up well today. But if you want a slightly more updated look that ramps up the terror even further, the remake is still excellent and a personal favorite that I like to regularly revisit for both nostalgia and, again, just spooky purposes. And because I'm a big fan of portable horror, it's an excellent fit for the Steam Deck. From a control perspective, it works fine by default, but you will have to make the choice as to whether you want the more traditional, modern analog controls, or if you'd like to go back to the tried and true tank-style controls. Now personally, I think both have their merits, but as somebody who grew up on the originals, I almost always go for tank-style controls for these games. Graphically, it doesn't appear to have a setting for the deck's 1280 by 800 resolution, so you'll need to go in and set it to 1280 by 720. Also, the frame rate is set at 30 by default, so you'll want to go ahead and bump that up to 60 in the graphics settings, and you can also push all of these settings to high quality and even max out the anti-aliasing if you want. All the while, it didn't seem to have any problems keeping a steady frame rate. And because it's not exactly the most taxing title you can play on the deck, it looks like you can squeeze about 3 hours of play out of it, and it will be a gorgeous 3 hours as you explore the secrets of the mansion, all while the occasional flashes of lightning punctuate your unsettling journey through its rooms. I'd say in the modern age it's pretty much the definitive way to enjoy Resident Evil 1, unless you're a purist who really is only going to be satisfied with the original. But if you're fine with a lovingly crafted update, it's an excellent entry in Resident Evil's decades-long history, and at this point one of the few remaining entries in the series that really focuses on survival much more than action. Don't get me wrong, I love the later entries too, but I have at least a few friends who have also grown up alongside the series who were a little sour on more modern entries, preferring the fixed camera angle, survival-focused entries of yesteryear. And I think Resident Evil 1 Remake really strikes a good balance between the two, and again, with spooky season only a few weeks out at this point, there's never been a better time to revisit a classic. And speaking of AAA classics that would eventually get a remaster, the final entry on this list is also admittedly a little bit of a cheat, but I threw it in anyways, and that is Modern Warfare Remastered. I feel like I couldn't do a AAA video without including Call of Duty somewhere on this list, and originally I was going to do Modern Warfare 2, considering the new Modern Warfare 2 is just around the corner, but ultimately I decided to do Modern Warfare Remaster from 2016 instead. Mostly because it seemed to get up and running more easily without a lot of remapping of the controls, plus I hadn't played the original since like 2008, so 14 years ago. Now obviously this is a big visual upgrade over the original, but it was still really fun going back through the cargo ship level, and it really reminded me of how great COD is at doling out big over-the-top action set pieces when it wants to. So more than anything, it was just a nice trip down memory lane that I took to sort of reignite my excitement for Call of Duty. Personally, I always thought of the Call of Duty franchise as a whole kind of like Chipotle. I'm pretty sure what I'm going to get every time I go back to it, and even though it's not exactly top-tier dining, it is pretty consistently great at scratching that shoot stuff tactically itch. And in playing it on the deck, it performed at a solid 60 without breaking a sweat, and again, the controls are ready to go as soon as you fire it up, without much need for customization unless you're a diehard who demands a finer-tuned experience. But if you're a filthy casual like me who just really wants to relive the experience that really ushered the Call of Duty series into the wildly popular perennial favorite with hundreds of millions of players that it is today, it's definitely worth revisiting, but make no mistake, if you preferred another entry in the series, there are a lot of them that seem to play just fine on the deck if you're looking for a quick trip on the hype train leading up to Modern Warfare 2 next month. Alright, so that's it for this one. Again, I really tried to stick the landing here and just focus very particularly on AAA experiences, just really big, exciting titles that were released in the past, 10, 15, 20 years, I guess. But hey, what about you? Are there any particular AAA titles that you think I should check out on the Steam Deck, maybe for a follow-up to this video? If so, let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for taking the time out of your day to watch videos on this channel. I really appreciate that. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one.